Hi, I'm Marcel, and welcome to me screaming into the void, mostly about books. I am doing a challenge where I try to read books that I already own. It's Read What You Own challenge, created by Criminology. And I have just finished Norwegian literary history, based on my own memory, by Knut Nærum. Knut Nærum is a Norwegian comedian, and Norwegian is also my first language. That's why you might see some Norwegian books on this channel. And in this one, he is simply summing up the Norwegian literary history from the Vikings, where they had the runes, and up to the present day when this book was published, which was, I think, 2008-ish. Yeah, I thought this was a funny read. Most of this I already knew, kind of. But it was interesting, because it's mostly interesting to see how someone creates a narrative and creates a history. It's not a very big book. You can't really fit much into it. At the same time, you have to include things that you might not necessarily include. One of the things that, for example, was interesting with most of Norwegian history is that Norway was in a union that became a union with Denmark from the middle of the 1300s up until we were given away to Sweden in 1814. And those 500 years are sort of talked about as the darkness in Norwegian history, because there isn't much material left. Sort of Denmark was the cultural center. And even in this book, he tries to sort of say something about these 500 years in our history, even if it's not that much to put there, because then you have to sort of talk about and not necessarily agree, but present, well, what were we? Were we actually a part of Denmark? And in that sense can hold aloft things that happened in Denmark as part of Norwegian history. We have sort of one very famous author from this time called Ludvig Holberg, who wrote very funny plays, but he lived in Denmark because that's the only place you could really survive as a playwright, even if it was Norwegian and was kind of dubious on what he sort of identified with. But so Knut Nærum tries to sort of create a larger part of this, because you sort of, otherwise it's just nothing. It's nothingness. So that's interesting to sort of see in all of that. And it's also interesting, of course, because it makes me think, well, what would I choose if I had 10 books to present and talk about as sort of an introduction to Norwegian literature? What books would I choose? How would I present it? So I did just create a list just for my own amusement, to sort of see if I was going to sort of present 10 books as a sort of introduction, or not necessarily an introduction, because what do you mean with an introduction? Or sort of, there are a lot of videos about start here regarding French or classics, but then you sort of assume that you're presenting the easy books, and this isn't necessarily sort of 10 easy Norwegian books, but these are 10 books to sort of show the complexity and diversity of Norwegian literature throughout history and throughout genre. So if I'm going to give 10 recommendations, I would go with Voluspa, which is a northern mythology epic poem that talks a lot about the Norse gods and the ideas around the Norse gods. Then, of course, you can't really start a list of Norwegian literature without talking about Ibsen. And what I actually would recommend, because I assume that you have read The Doll's House, because everyone has read The Doll's House if they read Ibsen. So I'm going to give you another recommendation, and that is The Wild Duck, which is very similar on the ideas that you find in The Dollhouse, but at the same time presented them with a slight sort of turn to it. Then I would, of course, recommend Sigrid Undset, which is one of our Nobel laureates for literature. Kristin Lavransdatter, that is one of my absolutely favorite books. So, and to show sort of a variation for the types of books, because Voluspa and The Wild Duck and Kristin Lavransdatter is considered sort of the classics. But I also wanted to show more, sort of the variation for it. And I wanted to then just sort of give an advice of Aunt Ulrike's Road by Shazan Sakar. And he is actually a Norwegian of Pakistani descent. And that book is one of the most popular books that we have, or not necessarily have, but was one of the first popularized books talking about growing up as Norwegian Pakistani. And that is interesting because Norwegian Pakistani is probably one of the largest minorities of color that we have in Norway. Then I wanted to recommend Aurora of Anne-Kat. Vesli, which is a children's book. And Aurora is interesting because it is a series of children's books, and it talks about children growing up in what we would call Drabantby, and I don't really know what the English translation of that would be, but it is a collection of high houses that aren't necessarily within the city centre, but where you sort of build a lot of blocks with apartments that are more affordable than other type of living. And in addition to that, so Aurora is growing up in one of these Drabantbys, and she also has a stay-at-home dad in comparison to a stay-at-home mom, which was kind of revolutionary when Anne-Kat. Vesli wrote the series in the 1960s and 70s. Of course, you can't really talk about Norwegian literature without talking about Jon Fosse, who won the Nobel Prize of Literature last year, from when this video is posted. And the video and the book I would actually recommend is The Septology, which is one of the last books that he published. And it is absolutely perfection in regard to Fosse. It's very dense, wonderful language. And if you want to understand why he won the Nobel Prize of Literature, you should start with that one. Then to sort of show sort of diversity of this of Norwegian literature, so that you can pick whatever sounds good to you. I wanted to recommend Margit Sandemon, who was probably the one that sort of popularized the idea of kiosk novels in Norway, and it just won an award for her dedication to making people read in Norway, because she wrote the book The Legend of Ice People, which is a series, and the first one is called Spellbound. And the books are accessible, easy to read, were very popular when they were published in the 1980s and 1990s. And they were considered sort of, and I've always heard that they had no literary qualities. She was not allowed into the Writers' Union because she wasn't writing literature. It was just entertainment. And honestly, I was then surprised when I read Spellbound about how well written it was, how good literary qualities it was. It's not on sort of the same way that Jon Fosse has marvelous literary qualities, because they're writing two different genres. Jon Fosse is not writing light entertainment, but Margit Sandemon isn't trying to write advanced literature. That doesn't mean that what she isn't presenting isn't a brilliant example of what kioskromaner actually can be and can achieve from a literary quality perspective. So I thought she was, again, no one should feel sorry for her. She's a multimillionaire. She's doing fine. But I was actually surprised, based on the reputation that that book series has, that it's as well written as it is. Then I wanted to recommend an author, going back to sort of the more classical books. It's called Oscar Bråten and the Child. And Oscar Bråten wrote in the early 1900s and wrote about the budding working class that was developing in Oslo in the 1900s. In Norway, we have a national minority called the Sami, and I wanted to recommend a book by a Sami author called Aikomatti, King Ahab. And I don't want to recommend it just because Aikomatti was a Sami author, because that's like, oh, well, I need to sort of do something just because it represents Samis. I wanted to recommend it because it's a genuinely wonderful book, because of his honest dealings with his Sami identity. One thing that might surprise especially Americans, because they're so sort of to focus a lot about skin color, but the Samis are actually white, and a lot of Samis will not have a lot of very distinct physical features that separate them from the majority society. So what's interesting with Aikomatti is that when he was very clever, he was given a chance to get a higher education. And the reality is that he had the opportunity to hide and pass for being ethnic Norwegian and sort of suppress his Sami identity. And what he does with this book in King Ahab is talking about the dilemmas that he feels with balancing the majority Norwegian and the Sami identity and the opportunities through that. And lastly, I want to go even further back. I don't know. It's just random. I just wrote them down as I thought of them. It's Betrayed by Amalie Skram. She is one of our naturalist authors, and what I really enjoyed, I think Amalie Skram is a wonderful author, and the reason I wanted to talk about this book, or present it, promote it, recommend it, is because it starts with a very young girl on her wedding day who is getting married to a man who is much older than her. And then on her wedding day, this girl is horrified to realize that there is going to be sex involved on their wedding night, because she has no concept of what sex is. And she comes and visits her mother afterwards and asks her, why did you not prepare me for the fact that it is expected of me to have sex with my husband? What is this thing? And the mother was like, oh, I thought you talked with that with your friends. Isn't that what youth does? That's where I learned about it. So what Amalie Skram sort of talks about in this book is a brilliant analysis of how unprepared young girls in the late 1800s were for what would be expected from them, because no one thought about talking about things like sex and childbirth and child rearing with these girls. They were just expected to figure it out of their own. So that's my 10 recommendations. Please let me know if you have read any of them, what you think about them. Also let me know if you want to hear more about any of them, and I'll make a specific video on that book. And I want to give you a challenge, and that is to think about what 10 books would you pick to represent your country's literary history. I want to see dozens of examples in the comments down below. And before we go any further, I need to pick the next book that I'm going to read. So I have my trusted little jar, and you'll see it before I see it. Yes, and it's book 23. Here is 23. So my husband actually picked and wrapped all of the books, so I have no idea. Okay, I have some idea based on the gaps of books on our bookshelves, but other than that, I have no idea what books that he picked out. And this one was very well wrapped. And Stealing the Mona Lisa, what art stops us from seeing. When the Mona Lisa was stolen from the Louvre in 1911, thousands of people flocked to see the empty space where it once had been on display. What could have drawn these crowds to stare at a blank wall? Many of them have never seen the painting in the first place. Can this tell us something about why we look at art, why artists create it, and why it has to be so expensive? So this is a philosophy book about art, philosophy, why we look at the books that we look at, the art that we look at. This is going to be quite fun to read, and I like that he has picked out quite a variation of books, even if we have a lot of non-fiction, because we do have a lot of non-fiction books on our bookshelves. So this is going to be my next read for Read What You Own, And thank you for listening to me screaming into the void.